What if the most expensive weapon in US history was just stripped bare in front of the world? That is the question that hung in the air one humid evening in Hefei, China, as the lights of a cavernous research hall flickered to life. Shadows crawled across the polished floor until they converged on a massive, jagged structure in the center. It wasn't a jet. It wasn't a missile. It was something far quieter, far stranger, a new kind of radar array, its spindly arms reaching upward like an antenna ready to speak to the heavens. The audience, engineers, journalists, a scattering of officials, sat in silence. And then, a whisper began, this machine could see what was never meant to be seen. For decades, Americans had been told a story. The F-35 fighter jet wasn't just a plane, it was a phantom, a ghost in the sky, the embodiment of invincibility wrapped in the cloak of stealth. Trillions of dollars, countless headlines, and endless boasts had reinforced the myth. Stealth was not just military hardware, it was a narrative of superiority, a way to say, we cannot be touched. But here, in a hall thousands of miles away from Washington, that narrative faced its first crack. The lead scientist stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. In the measured tones of someone who knows the world is about to change, he announced, this system was capable of detecting stealth aircraft. The claim landed like a thunderclap. The journalists shifted in their seats. Some scoffed quietly. Others scribbled furiously. But everyone knew they had just witnessed a direct challenge to the very foundation of American air power. And deep inside the Pentagon, as the news traveled across encrypted channels, unease began to spread. Because if this claim was true, then stealth, the crown jewel of US dominance, wasn't untouchable anymore. It was vulnerable. The illusion of invisibility could be shattered. What these scientists claimed that day sent shivers through the Pentagon. And yet, in that moment, it was only words, a promise, a seed of doubt planted in the minds of the mighty. The real question wasn't whether China could make such a claim. The real question was whether they could prove it. And that was the part nobody was ready for. To understand the magnitude of what was whispered in Hefei, you have to understand what the F-35 really is, not just a jet, not just a weapon, but the single most expensive military project in human history. Trillions of dollars have been poured into its development. For decades, it has been sold to the American people and to allies across the globe as the embodiment of 21st-century dominance. Sleek lines, cutting-edge avionics, and most of all, stealth, the promise that this aircraft could slip through the skies unseen, untouchable, a phantom force projecting American power anywhere, anytime. Stealth wasn't just a technical feature. It became an identity. The idea that US planes could fly invisible above hostile nations was part of a broader mythology. America as the lone superpower, capable of striking without warning, immune from retaliation. It reassured allies and terrified adversaries. It justified the astronomical price tag. It was, in effect, a narrative that said, the future belongs to us, because we can see you, and you cannot see us. But what happens when that story begins to crack? What happens when another nation dares to say, we can see your ghost? That is why the Hefei announcement mattered so deeply. If China's radar could truly pierce the shroud of stealth, then the F-35 was no longer a symbol of invincibility, it was just another jet, burdened with flaws, exposed in the skies. And if that illusion collapsed, so too would the aura of American supremacy. For years, critics of the F-35 program had whispered doubts. Reports of design flaws, maintenance nightmares, software glitches. Yet none of those ever pierced the heart of the myth, because at the end of the day, the jet was still invisible. It could still slip past defenses. That was the trump card. That was the insurance policy. Take that away, and suddenly every weakness becomes fatal. A jet that can be seen can be targeted. A jet that can be targeted can be destroyed. And so the implications were staggering. If Hefei's claim was real, it didn't just mean trouble for the Pentagon's balance sheets. It meant a tectonic shift in global power. Allies who had bought into the F-35 program, countries that staked their defense strategies on the promise of American stealth, would begin to wonder if they had bought into a lie. Adversaries would sense opportunity. The entire architecture of deterrence, built on the faith that US jets could fly unseen, would begin to wobble. That is why the Pentagon shuddered. Not because of one radar in one Chinese lab, but because of the story that radar threatened to unravel. Stealth was more than technology. It was psychological. It was geopolitical. It was identity. And to strip it away was to strike at the very heart of what America told itself, and the world, about its place in history. Yet in that Hefei hall, on that night, it was still only a claim. Words. The real battle would not be fought in the silence of laboratories but in the eyes of the watching world. Could this strange array of antennas truly see what no one else could? Could it expose the phantom? The answer to that question would determine more than the fate of a single jet. It would determine the credibility of a superpower. But what was revealed next would change everything. The story of the F-35 began, like so many American legends, with promises written in fire across the sky. In the aftermath of the Cold War, when the United States stood alone as the undisputed superpower, military strategists dreamed of a weapon that would guarantee dominance for generations. That dream became the Joint Strike Fighter program. Its mission was nothing less than audacious: to create a plane that could outfly, outfight, and above all, outdisappear every rival aircraft on Earth. The jet would be the crown jewel of American ingenuity, proof that no matter how the world changed, the US would always stay one step ahead, unseen, untouchable. From its inception, the F-35 was branded as a revolution. Politicians boasted that it was not merely a plane but an entire future wrapped in steel and software. Contractors promised invisibility. Defense officials spoke of full-spectrum dominance, the idea that America could operate anywhere, anytime, without fear. Stealth wasn't just a technical gimmick, it was marketed as destiny. And the world listened. Allies lined up to buy into the project. Newspapers hailed it as the aircraft that would rule the skies well into the 21st century. But behind the curtain of triumph lay a more complicated truth. The F-35 quickly became the most expensive weapons program in human history. Costs ballooned. Deadlines slipped. Reports piled up of glitches that grounded entire squadrons. Pilots complained of systems that crashed mid-flight, helmets that blinded instead of guided, maintenance costs that drained defense budgets dry. Each flaw raised eyebrows, but each time the response was the same: it doesn't matter, because the plane is invisible. And an invisible jet, they said, was worth every dollar, every sacrifice. This was the illusion, a Goliath striding the battlefield, confident in its cloak, blind to its own vulnerabilities. America poured its treasure and its pride into this project, convinced that no one could challenge its supremacy. The very arrogance of the program was stitched into its DNA. Even when allies worried about ballooning costs, even when independent watchdogs questioned whether the jet could actually perform in combat, U.S. officials reassured them: stealth is invincibility. Stealth is immortality. Trust us. But trust has limits. Beneath the surface, cracks spread. Engineers scrambled to patch problems that never seemed to end. Billions more were spent to fix billions already wasted. And yet, the myth endured. To admit weakness would be to admit that America's empire of the skies had been built on sand. So the narrative hardened: the F-35 was untouchable, because it could not be seen. Every doubt was drowned beneath that single claim. Yet arrogance breeds blindness. While the Pentagon boasted, while defense contractors cashed their checks, the rest of the world watched. Rivals studied. Adversaries listened. They understood that if the magic trick of stealth could be pierced, the illusion would collapse. The mighty would stand naked. The Goliath, for all its size and power, would be revealed as blind. The tragedy of the F-35 is not only its flaws but the hubris it represents. A nation so convinced of its exceptionalism that it mistook invisibility for invulnerability. A weapon so expensive, so hyped, that it became a cage for the very superpower that built it. America could not question it, because to question it was to question the myth of itself. And so the blind Goliath strode on, carrying the weight of arrogance on its back. But myths do not endure forever. Somewhere far from Washington, in laboratories where the world spotlight rarely shone, others were watching with different eyes. They saw through the boast, through the illusion. And they quietly asked themselves a question: if the F-35's greatest strength was its invisibility, what would happen if we learned to see the unseen? Meanwhile, in silence, across the ocean, others were preparing their answer. In the quiet city of Hefei, far from the thunderous speeches of Washington and the glittering defense expos of Paris or London, a different story was being written. It did not come with boasts, billion-dollar commercials, or flashy displays of power. Instead, it unfolded inside laboratories where the hum of fluorescent lights replaced the roar of engines, and the dedication of men and women in white coats became the true weapon of the state. Here, in this unassuming city, the seeds of China's technological rise were being sown, patiently, quietly, and with a determination that did not need applause. The researchers who filled these labs were not household names. They were not celebrities or politicians. They were often the children of farmers, factory workers, and teachers, raised in a country that for centuries had been told it lagged behind, that it would never catch up. Many of them had studied abroad, often facing discrimination, before returning home to build something greater than themselves. Others had never left China, dedicating their lives to study while living on modest salaries, driven less by personal wealth than by a sense of mission. Together, they formed an underdog army of intellect, bonded not by fame but by sacrifice. Discipline was their armor. Long hours blurred into nights. Experiments failed, funding was tight, and the world paid little attention. But they did not stop. For them, this was not just about radar or aircraft detection. It was about dignity, about proving that China would never again be humiliated, never again dismissed as incapable of leading in science or technology. Each calculation, each sleepless night, was a small step toward rewriting history. In the United States, the F-35 was sold as an inevitability, a weapon too advanced to be challenged. But in Hefei, the researchers understood something the Pentagon had forgotten: technology is not destiny, it is discipline. And discipline, combined with persistence, can turn the impossible into the inevitable. They studied the frequencies, the scattering of waves, the flaws hidden beneath the skin of stealth aircraft. Where others saw invincibility, they saw equations to solve. Where others saw arrogance, they saw opportunity. This was the humility of their mission, not to boast, but to build. Not to declare themselves supreme, but to prove through results that no superpower holds a monopoly on innovation. Every radar dish that spun in their labs, every algorithm they refined, was a reminder that persistence can outlast pride. Their progress was rarely trumpeted in headlines, but in the corridors of power, quiet reports began to circulate. China was moving fast, faster than anyone had predicted. And beneath their work was a profound sense of national pride. These scientists were not working for individual glory. They were working for a people, for a story older than any fighter jet, a story of a nation rising after centuries of being cast as weak or backward. For them, the project in Hefei was not just about military parity, it was about rewriting the narrative of who gets to lead the future. To pierce American stealth was to pierce the myth of American inevitability. It was to declare, without fanfare, we, too, can see the unseen. This contrast, between quiet sacrifice and loud arrogance, between humility and hubris, could not have been starker. In America, politicians and contractors wrapped themselves in illusions of grandeur, selling the F-35 as though it were a god of war. In China, engineers bent over lab benches, their only audience the silent hum of machinery, their only weapon patience. One side believed its supremacy eternal. The other side believed nothing is eternal except change. And it was change they were building, piece by piece, in that hall in Hefei. Not with the bluster of a trillion-dollar program, but with the quiet confidence of those who know that history does not reward arrogance, it rewards persistence. The Americans laughed, dismissed, ignored. But the researchers kept going. And slowly, invisibility began to look less like destiny, and more like a problem to be solved. What no one realized was that these underdog scientists were preparing not just a machine, but a moment. A moment that would ripple far beyond their laboratory. A moment that would test the myth of American invincibility and force the world to see power through a different lens. A moment born not of arrogance, but of sacrifice. And that contrast would explode onto the global stage. The day of the press conference arrived like a storm long whispered about but never truly believed. In Hefei's Modern Science and Technology Hall, the stage was set with a sleek podium and a massive screen looming above. Rows of journalists, defense analysts, and foreign observers filled the seats, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and, in some cases, quiet dread. Outside, the streets buzzed with anticipation. For most Chinese citizens, this was more than a technical presentation, it was a symbolic moment of pride, proof that their country had arrived on the global stage of innovation. The lead researcher stepped forward, calm and deliberate, his voice carrying none of the bravado that so often filled Western defense unveilings. He introduced the radar system with the precision of a scientist and the gravity of a man who knew history was in the making. Charts and diagrams lit up the screen, frequency bands, detection ranges, performance metrics. Each line of data was delivered with restraint, with confidence rooted not in spectacle but in substance. The room, however, was divided. Chinese journalists leaned forward, nodding, eager to capture every word. Western reporters exchanged glances, their pens hesitant, their brows furrowed. For them, the claim seemed audacious, perhaps too audacious. Was this truly possible? Could this machine, standing behind the curtains, really pierce the cloak of the F-35? Across the Pacific, U.S. defense commentators wasted no time in dismissing the announcement. On cable news panels and military forums, voices scoffed, propaganda, some said. Unverified boasting, others insisted. A retired general chuckled on air, calling it a desperate attempt by Beijing to spook Washington. The word impossible echoed again and again, as though sheer repetition could build a shield strong enough to fend off the fear gnawing beneath. But inside that hall, the atmosphere was different. There was no laughter. No dismissal. Only tension that grew with each passing slide. Because everyone in that room knew that data could be debated, but proof could not. And the audience, packed tight into those rows of seats, was waiting for exactly that, proof. When the researcher paused, the silence was electric. He glanced toward the side of the stage, where a curtain concealed the machine itself. The journalists tensed. Photographers lifted their cameras. Even the skeptics felt their throats tighten. This was the moment the world had come for, not the diagrams, not the equations, but the unveiling of the thing itself. Slowly, the curtain drew back. The radar array stood in full view, a strange, angular construct of steel and sensors, bristling with antennas. Its form was alien, almost unsettling, as though it had been built not for the human eye but for the invisible realm of waves and echoes. Gasps rippled through the audience. Flashbulbs exploded. The scientists did not flinch. They let the machine speak for itself. Still, doubt lingered. Was this theater, or was this history? The Americans watching from afar clung to their certainty. No radar could see the F-35. It was an article of faith as much as a military fact. But faith wavers in the face of demonstration. And that was what the audience demanded, something undeniable, something that could no longer be brushed aside as rumor or propaganda. The lead scientist's voice returned, steady, unhurried. He spoke of the tests they had conducted, the targets detected, the stealth profiles unraveled. Each word tightened the grip of suspense, pulling the audience closer to the edge. Skeptics whispered, critics scribbled, supporters leaned in with shining eyes. Every ear strained for the one thing that could tip this from speculation into revelation. The tension was unbearable now. Even the most hardened analysts in the room could not hide their anticipation. What would happen if the radar truly worked? What would it mean for the future of air power, for the myth of stealth, for the balance of the world itself? Then came the demonstration no one was ready for. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the auditorium as the lead scientist raised his hand. Behind him, the enormous screen flickered to life. The first image appeared, the unmistakable outline of a stealth fighter, sleek and predatory, suspended against a digital sky. The words "Simulation Test 1" glowed in red at the corner of the screen. The scientist's voice, calm but steady, began to narrate. He explained how the F-35 stealth worked, how its faceted surfaces, radar-absorbent materials, and heat-masking systems were all designed to confuse and deflect conventional radar. It was a lesson the world already knew. But then he shifted to the heart of the matter. Traditional radars rely on narrow frequency bands, he said. Stealth aircraft are designed to exploit that limitation. But what happens, he paused, letting the silence stretch, when multiple frequencies converge, overlap, and see together what one alone cannot? On cue, the simulation shifted. A conventional radar sweep appeared, showing an empty grid. The jet was invisible, just as the Americans had promised. But then a second wave emerged, this time layered with multiple bands. Slowly, faint dots began to flicker across the screen. They grew stronger, clearer. The shape of the stealth fighter, once ghost-like, solidified in bright outline. The auditorium gasped. It was there. Not a phantom, not a rumor, there, visible, undeniable. Western analysts in the audience leaned forward, their skepticism melting into unease. For decades, they had heard claims, rumors of so-called breakthroughs. None had ever come this close, this sharp, this public. A murmur of disbelief swept through the rows of foreign journalists. Could this be real? Or was it just a clever sleight of hand? But the scientist was not finished. He gestured again, and the second simulation began. This time, the radar's feed was matched against actual flight test data. The F-35 silhouette appeared, this time crossing the grid at different angles, its stealth profile designed to exploit vulnerabilities. Once again, the multiband system tracked it, revealing not just its presence but its heading, altitude, even its speed. Each layer of detail was like a hammer blow to the myth of invisibility. The lead scientist explained softly, almost clinically, when you see with multiple eyes, no shadow can hide. When you listen across the spectrum, no silence is complete. His words struck like poetry, yet behind them was mathematics, engineering, and years of discipline. The effect was devastating. The Americans watching remotely scrambled for explanations. Defense commentators online insisted this was exaggeration, selective data, propaganda dressed as proof. But the faces of the experts in that room told another story. They weren't scoffing anymore. They were pale, their pens frozen, their eyes glued to the screen as the invisible became visible again and again. Then came the most audacious moment. The screen went dark for a beat, and when it lit again, a title appeared, Quantum Detection Research. Gasps rippled across the hall. The lead scientist cautioned that this was still experimental, still in its early stages. But the implication was unmistakable. Using quantum entanglement and photon detection, the system hinted at the ability to bypass even the most advanced stealth measures, reaching into the very fabric of physics itself. The word quantum carried with it an aura of inevitability, the next frontier, the next weapon in the silent arms race. The demonstration moved methodically, each step building suspense. First, invisibility. Then detection. Then tracking. Then, finally, the promise of future dominance. With each reveal, the Chinese audience grew more animated. Applause erupted. Some rose to their feet. For them, this was not just science, it was vindication, a moment of national pride decades in the making. In the West, the silence was deafening. Analysts could not deny what their eyes had just witnessed, even as they struggled to explain it away. For years, they had ridiculed China's ambitions, dismissing its labs as imitators, its engineers as mere copycats. Yet here was a system that was not copied, not stolen, but created, something new, something formidable. The scientist let the final image linger, a bright, undeniable radar trace of the F-35, captured cleanly, stripped of its cloak. He looked up, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Invisibility is an illusion. Nothing is beyond reach." The words hung in the air like a verdict, final and devastating. The hall erupted. Applause thundered through the chamber. Chinese journalists cheered openly. Students in the back wept. They understood the symbolism, the moment the myth collapsed. Their nation, once mocked as the factory of the world, had struck a blow against the very foundation of American supremacy. For the Westerners present, it was humiliation cloaked in disbelief. A British defense correspondent muttered under his breath, "If this is real, the entire air strategy of NATO collapses." A U.S. analyst stared blankly, whispering to a colleague, "This can't be happening." But it was happening. The myth was no longer myth. The phantom had been seen. The mic drop moment came not from a shout, not from fanfare, but from silence, the silence after the final slide disappeared, when the only sound was applause and the pounding realization in every foreign heart that the balance of power had shifted. A cloak that once made America invincible had been lifted. The emperor, it seemed, had no clothes. The scientists bowed slightly and stepped away, leaving the machine glowing quietly behind them. There were no chants of conquest, no arrogant boasts, only the quiet confidence of those who knew they had changed history. The triumph was not in words but in the undeniable proof that had just shattered decades of Western certainty. Outside the hall, reporters rushed to their phones, their laptops, their cameras. Headlines formed in real time: China claims radar breakthrough. End of stealth? F-35 exposed? The world's news feeds began to churn, but it was only the beginning. Because if the unveiling shook those in the room, the true explosion would come once the images, the clips, the whispers spread across the world. By dawn, social media would erupt like wildfire. By the time the first rays of morning sunlight touched Beijing, the internet was already ablaze. On Chinese social media platforms, clips of the Hefei demonstration spread like fire in dry grass. Hashtags surged to the top of trending lists, hashtag stealth no more, hashtag China sees all, hashtag F-35 unmasked. Memes poured in by the thousands, some mocking the once vaunted American fighter, others celebrating the patient scientists who had humbled a superpower. One viral cartoon showed the F-35 draped in an invisibility cloak, only for a Chinese radar dish to yank it off like a magician revealing a cheap trick. The laughter was contagious, but beneath the humor was a current of pride that electrified an entire nation. In the West, the reaction was more fractured, more chaotic. On Twitter and Facebook, the same clips appeared, though the hashtags carried a sharper edge: hashtag propaganda stunt, hashtag end of stealth, hashtag Cold War II. Defense commentators scrambled to stake their ground. Some dismissed the demonstration as smoke and mirrors, a carefully staged illusion meant to rattle American nerves. Others, though, sounded alarm bells, their voices edged with panic. "If this holds up," one analyst tweeted, "the F-35 is no longer the tip of the spear, it's a sitting duck." The clash of denial and fear echoed across timelines, each retweet amplifying the noise. Cable news caught fire with round-the-clock coverage. In Washington, anchors debated breathlessly: was this real? Could the Pentagon's crown jewel truly be exposed? Some networks leaned into skepticism, bringing in retired generals to reassure viewers that American stealth remained unmatched. But even they could not fully mask the tremor in their voices. Other networks leaned hard into the drama, flashing graphics that screamed "end of an era," while guests spoke in dire tones about the collapse of air superiority. One host summed it up with words that resonated across screens: "We are watching the unraveling of the American military myth, live." Allies were watching too. In London, Paris, and Tokyo, defense ministries convened urgent meetings. Billions had been spent on the F-35 program, sold to partners as a guarantee of future security. If that guarantee had been hollow, the betrayal was more than financial, it was existential. Quietly, questions began to rise. Had the US sold its friends a promise it could not keep? Had Washington's arrogance left its allies vulnerable? The ripple of doubt was as dangerous as any radar beam, because it cut through the very trust that held alliances together. Politicians seized the moment. In Beijing, officials hailed the demonstration as a triumph of discipline and national will. State media amplified the message: the age of humiliation was over, China could no longer be ignored or underestimated. In Washington, the mood was grim. Senators sparred on the floor, some demanding immediate investigations into the vulnerabilities of stealth, others insisting that panic played into Beijing's hands. A presidential spokesperson stood at the podium, repeating the line, "The United States remains unmatched in military capability." But the words sounded thinner than ever, echoing against a backdrop of doubt. Meanwhile, ordinary people joined the storm. On TikTok, teenagers stitched together videos of the Hefei radar reveal with footage of Marvel heroes stripping away cloaks of invisibility. On Reddit, long threads dissected the technical details, some convincing, others wild speculation. On YouTube, commentators released fiery monologues about the dawn of a new Cold War. The internet had turned the Hefei announcement into not just a scientific claim, but a cultural moment, a meme-worthy spectacle that no one could ignore. Even celebrities joined in. A Chinese pop star tweeted, "Our scientists just made the invisible visible, proud to be Chinese today." An American comedian shot back with biting sarcasm, "Great, now even our trillion-dollar planes need therapy." The contrast captured the mood perfectly, triumph on one side, nervous laughter on the other. But beneath the noise, a quieter realization began to settle in. For decades, America's strength had rested not only on weapons, but on perception, on the belief that its technology was unbeatable, its future unshakable. The Hefei demonstration struck at that perception. It didn't matter yet whether every claim was proven true. What mattered was that the illusion of invincibility had been broken. Doubt had entered the bloodstream of global power. And once doubt spreads, it is nearly impossible to contain. The shockwaves kept rolling, from the halls of government to the chatter of ordinary citizens. China's pride was undeniable. America's uncertainty was unavoidable. The world was recalibrating in real time, and the center of gravity felt as though it had shifted, if only slightly, away from Washington. But the real question wasn't what China gained, it was what America just lost. When the dust settled and the headlines began to fade, what remained was not simply a contest of machines, but a contest of values. The Hefei demonstration was more than a technical challenge, it was a moral parable unfolding on the global stage. On one side stood arrogance, draped in the illusion of invincibility. On the other stood humility, forged in the fire of persistence and discipline. The outcome revealed not just who had the sharper radar, but who had understood the deeper truth about power in the 21st century. For years, the United States had told the world that stealth was destiny. It had built a mythology around invisibility, a belief that supremacy could be maintained by staying forever unseen, forever untouchable. That illusion fueled trillion-dollar budgets, justified endless wars, and convinced allies to buy into promises that were always just beyond verification. Yet arrogance is a fragile armor. The louder it boasts, the thinner it grows. And in Hefei, that armor cracked. By contrast, the Chinese engineers who unveiled their radar had built their victory not on swagger, but on sacrifice. They did not have trillion-dollar programs or glossy advertising campaigns. They had long nights, failed experiments, and the unglamorous grind of data and testing. They had patience. They had humility. And it was precisely those qualities, the ones dismissed as weakness by the arrogant, that allowed them to achieve what once seemed impossible. Their triumph was not the sudden brilliance of a single genius, but the collective persistence of ordinary people committed to an extraordinary mission. This is the moral heartbeat of the story. Power does not come from illusions, from myths shouted until they are believed. Real power emerges from truth, truth-tested, refined, and proven. America's mistake was to confuse image with reality. China's quiet answer was to show that reality, when faced directly, will always outlast illusion. The lesson is not limited to nations or weapons. It speaks to the human condition. Arrogance convinces us that we are untouchable, that our power is permanent, that no one can see through our disguises. Humility reminds us that no disguise lasts forever, that persistence can pierce even the most carefully crafted cloak. Invisibility is not safety, it is an illusion. Transparency, though vulnerable, is where real strength lives. As the lead scientist said in Hefei, invisibility is an illusion. Nothing is beyond reach. His words rang far beyond the walls of that hall, they became a reflection for the world itself. For progressive audiences, for immigrants who know the power of resilience, for communities long told they would never be seen, this story carries another layer of meaning. The myth of invincibility has been wielded for decades to silence, to intimidate, to erase. But when the unseen becomes seen, dignity returns. What happened in Hefei was not just a military challenge, but a metaphor. Persistence can unmask arrogance, humility can outlast hubris, and truth can shatter illusion. And so the symbolism is clear. The hero of this story is not a jet, nor a nation, but the discipline of engineers, the persistence of scientists, the dignity of those who build quietly without applause. The villain is not a country, but the dangerous belief that power can be built on arrogance alone. Power doesn't lie in the lie of invisibility, but in the truth of transparency. And that truth, painful for some, liberating for others, cannot be hidden behind any cloak. And as the world watched the myth unravel, one question remained hanging in the air, unanswered, undeniable. If the age of invisibility was over, what would the age to come look like? What if the most expensive weapon in US history was just stripped bare in front of the world? That was the question that opened this story, and now we know the answer. In a hall in Hefei, before the eyes of journalists, scientists, and skeptics alike, the cloak of invisibility was pulled away. What was once untouchable is now vulnerable. What was once myth is now questioned. And with that single revelation, the balance of power shifted, not in the silence of laboratories, but in the imagination of nations. History rarely announces itself with fanfare. More often, it arrives in quiet moments, a radar screen flickering with impossible clarity, a scientist's calm declaration, an audience holding its breath. Yet those moments can change the trajectory of the world. This was one of them. The Hefei demonstration was not only a technical achievement, but a historical turning point, the day the illusion cracked, and the future opened. What comes next is uncertain. Will America double down on arrogance or face its vulnerabilities? Will allies question what they were sold, or cling to faith in old promises? Will China's triumph become a new standard, or a spark that ignites rivalries yet to unfold? These are questions we will wrestle with in the days ahead. But one truth is clear, the myth of invisibility has been pierced, and nothing will ever look the same again. If you've stayed with us through this journey, you already know, history is flipping in real time. Don't blink, don't look away. Subscribe now, because the next moment history flips, you'll want to be here to see it.